The following is a conversation with the artist Andrew Carroll, whom I met in a pub following a conference on the death, crisis and resurrection of painting at Triskel Art Centre, Cork. I immediately found Andrew fascinating in how he thinks about art historically, philosophically and pop culturally. Andrew uploaded a still image from Joseph Beuys's performance with a new wave pop band in the 1980s. We use this as a foil to discuss still and moving images, the transcendental versus the political, and an array or panoply of other things that conjoin in a kind of monster of a conversation. The kind of conversations I really want to have during this series. I hope you enjoy. Thank you. Yeah, once again, listen, thanks for doing this, Andrew.
No problem.
It's since when I met you, kind of not for the first time, but in Cork, in that pub after that conference. I was really intrigued with what you said, actually, and what you discussed and how you thought about things. And I suppose then we initiated this prosody thing, this prosody 16 thing, where I kind of use it as an excuse both to have a conversation with artists, but also to produce something at the end of it, and something printed rather than digital. Even though the conversation is in a kind of weird way digital. So I'm trying to tackle with those two things. But the way I usually do this is that I kind of this image that you submitted and the text that you submitted, and they go side by side. And weirdly, usually artists send a work or an image that reflects their own work. Whereas you sent an image by another artist, but it's not by another artist, it's a screenshot of a performance by Joseph Beuys. So I had to go looking, because I hadn't heard of this. I wasn't a big Beuysian in my school days. I was more...
Did you say in your school days?
Yeah, my art school days.
Okay,
yeah.
right.
I wasn't Beuysian, even though I probably took so much from him without knowing it. And even saying that out loud, actually, I did this performance when I was doing my MFA in NCAD, where I built chalkboards, because he did this series of blackboard lectures, and that was he was a massive influence. But I was more interested in Kiefer as a painter. And they're quite, even though I'm not sure if Kiefer was a student of Beuys.
I think so.
Yeah, there's a mentoring going on between them.
There's a whole generation of those guys. Like Frank Auerbach is another one who learned an awful lot from Beuys. So there's a whole there's all Beuys' children basically, and they all went off and had their own individuation in some way. They all went off and sort of found themselves after Beuys, but there's that kind of romantic feeling, or there's a slightly bleak feeling to a lot of the work I always think Beuys' work is quite bleak. He's painting with like hare's blood, or so he's making out anyway. You never know whether to believe Beuys or not. But then the guys who came from Beuys, I can only think at the moment about Kiefer and Auerbach, but there's something kind of bleak and romantic about them in some way. So, I've always been interested. I was really, to go back to the idea of school, I was really interested in Beuys for about a year in the middle of art school. So I spent one of my 4 years in art school really delving deeply into Beuys. He fascinated me. And I think it was I wrote an essay about his shamanism, or his purported shamanism. There's that famous piece, I like America and America likes me. Are you familiar with that piece? Yeah. So I wrote an essay about his shamanism, and whenever I chose papers in college, it was always something I knew nothing about. I just wanted to really go on a journey and find something out about something that I didn't like. I wrote an essay on Picasso in second year, and the reason I wrote about Picasso was because the essay question was, how innovative was Picasso? And I'd been in New York with my family a year before I went to art school, and I'd seen a Picasso exhibition in the sorry, it's escaping my head at the moment, but the big cereal bowl museum, the Guggenheim in the middle of Manhattan. I call it the big cereal bowl. Um, but I'd seen Picasso, and it's a really disconcerting experience because you're looking at, it's kind of mid-career Picasso, so it's all these kind of angular, discombobulating paintings, and then you're on this ramp on the inside the cereal bowl, so you're standing with one foot lower than the other. So you're sort of, it's kind of like, I don't know if you remember the 1960s Batman. So the set design in that, when you went into like the Joker's lair, it was always like, I don't remember if it was the Riddler or the Joker, but it was always like all of these weird angles and suggesting his insanity. For some reason, that's kind of coming to mind, because I was standing sort of lopsided, looking at these really angular, sort of fractured paintings, and I really disliked it. I didn't like it at all, and I was like, what's the big fuss about Picasso? Because that was like an early experience of Picasso. And then, when I got handed this essay question in second year in college, I how innovative was Picasso? I was like, well, how innovative was Picasso? I really want to find this out. So I went and I delved really deep. So that was my attitude to papers. So I wrote a paper in third year on Beuys, and it fascinating, absolutely fascinating. A really fascinating figure, obviously a very intelligent figure, a very didactic figure. He was like a teacher, but a kind of a tragic figure as well. Like, I can get into that, later. But yeah, so that's kind of where my interest in Beuys. So I had a bit of an affair with Beuys for about a year, and then I sort of took a step back and I started looking at other stuff. After that, I got into my painting and stuff like that. So I kind of went in that direction after that. So
maybe we will, like, the best way I can do this in the beginning is refer back to the image.
Sure.
And the text.
Yeah. I don't actually remember the text, I have to say. Remind me what text you asked me to submit again.
So I'm going to read this out.
Okay.
So you can digest it then. So the image itself is of Beuys. And I had to look this up. You mentioned the name of the performance with this new wave German band. And I'll just read out the text. The image itself is quite, when you refer back to Batman in the 1960s, it has a sense of that, in that the postures of all these singers, backing singers, musicians, and then Beuys at the back, kind of dancing around and speaking. Yeah. And then I listened to the YouTube video of it. So it's 1982 or something like that. And it's in the time of Ronald Reagan in the States. So I'll read this out, and then maybe we can go from there. So when I was studying, it goes back to the school days, I suppose, the art school days. When I was studying at undergraduate level, I did quite a bit of research on Joseph Beuys. According to the literature I read on him, he was regarded in his day as some variation on a saint. Sometime later, I read about the encounter between Beuys and Warhol at the Guggenheim in New York, and about Beuys's comments about the silence of Marcel Duchamp, examples of how he interfaced with other artists. Eventually, I came across the image that I am submitting here, where Beuys momentarily joined a new wave group to sing Son Staat Reagan, a political message hidden in a goofy earworm of a song. However, I should feel about this piece of art itself. I like the less than transcendental context for Beuys in this instance. like the feet of a medicine man being brought solidly down to earth. So the image you supplied with that is of that performance. It's a screenshot. And yeah, I suppose begin perhaps, and there's some of the words I've plucked from this idea of the saint voice and the less than transcendental. And what I'm interested in here, and it's something you said to me actually after the conference in Cork, was about painting and the death of painting, or the end of painting.
Because that was a big topic at the conference, as it usually is in these, these contemporary or like recent, and by recent I mean maybe like 20, 30 years. When people are talking about painting, they're always talking about the death of painting. It's like it's almost a cliche.
Yeah. So Boyce fits into your in a weird way. Boyce and this image and the saint and sainthood, and even your reflections on shamanism, and the death of painting, and your opinion on painting as this kind of, or the discourse around painting as being transcendental. Because death, resurrection, all these big saintly biblical words.
I guess so. Yeah, I didn't think about it as transcendental actually, but that's interesting.
So maybe discuss that, maybe, because I kind of want to get closer to your work or your thoughts using voice painting as a foil to get closer to those ideas. So maybe talk a little bit about the text and where it is sourced from or where it comes from and the image.
So the text is my own text, but I suppose I did a bit of, to be honest, the image itself is the thing that had stuck in my mind from years ago. And I kind of went, what was that? It was like an image in my head of Boyce, in this weirdly, I thought it was a pop group. I didn't even think it was a new wave group. I thought it was like a pop group. And it kind of reminds me of when I was, and there's going to be a lot of pop culture references here, because that's part of my attraction to this. Like, I remember when it was about the late 90s, and I remember seeing a documentary. RT used to be great for running documentaries about one specific band, and the band were the Smashing Pumpkins. And there was the last album they made. It was called Machine of the Machines of God. And there was a documentary late night. It was always like late night, and you'd catch just randomly a Smashing Pumpkins documentary. And I was a bit of a Smashing Pumpkins fanatic. And it was just bliss for me to just come across these documentaries. And I remember the last one on the last album and the last tour. There was a scene with Billy Corgan. I don't know if you're familiar with Billy Corgan, but Billy Corgan is this 6 foot something, like he could have been a basketball player, like a very, very tall guy who dresses, he's self-described as a vampire. Like, he looks like a bald Nosferatu, like 6'8", not Nosferatu, he has the pointy teeth and everything, and I never conceived of Billy Corgan as a real person. He was like a character in my brain. And in this documentary, he gets into a car and he drives around Chicago, and he's like showing the people all the places where the band first practiced and the first club that they played at. And I was watching this and I go, Billy Corgan drives? And it was just such a moment for me. I was like, he's actually a real person who does real things, like in the world, like an everyday person. And it was actually really funny, just to skip ahead a little bit, and I'll come back to that image, but it's a really weird moment where Billy Corgan, like a lot of men in their late 40s or early 50s, had a bit of a midlife crisis, and he ended up on the front of some cat magazine showing his cats. So he brought ordinary to a sort of a like almost vomit-inducing level, and he was I don't remember who it was, but one of the like American newscasters brought this up like mockingly, and it was really like I was like, oh my God, this is like my childhood turned upside down or something, you know. Anyway, I'll come back to, but that whole thing of like this mystical figure in your imagination suddenly doing something really, really every day is, I think it's fascinating. I'm interested in it as a claim on their own humanity, on their own existence, on their own freedom to live as ordinary people, you know. And I don't think Boyce quite got there with this either. I mean, the title of the song is Sonnestat Reagan, which means sun, not rain. But when you hear it, I mean, it means that when you hear it. But when you see it written, it's Reagan, or Eagan, which means Reagan, the American president. And it's a Cold War. It's an objection to the Cold War, and it's an objection to the way the Americans were conducting themselves in relation to the Russians. Um, so it's political, and he doesn't quite, you know. I'm not saying there's some ideal that he could have reached, in terms of like high versus low culture, some amazing paradox that he could have hit right between high and low culture, but I think Boyce stayed very sort of he stayed highbrow to the end, and he had a kind of a intellectual, or kind of over didactic kind of persona that he projected, you know. The thing about the silence of Marcel Duchamp was always fascinating to me, and I don't know if you came across that before, but the quote was, "The silence of Marcel Duchamp is overrated." Because Duchamp went into a sort of retirement. He decided that he was finished with art in the middle of his career, and he went into this sort of retirement mode where he just went off and played chess. Which actually, just to comment on Marcel Duchamp for a second, isn't really a change of career, because I believe that Marcel Duchamp's most of his art career was a game of chess. I don't think he was really doing art. I think he was trying to outfox everybody else. I think he was a bit of a intellectual competitor, a bit of a snob intellectually, and he tended to try and beat everybody down intellectually. But so he was always playing chess. He just explicitly did it for this period. But I think Boyce was jealous in some weird way. There was this jealousy of the fact that Duchamp could remain as one of these godheads of the art world without saying anything, because Boyce had to say something all the time. He was almost like verbose. He was always talking. He was always teaching. He couldn't shut up. So I think maybe he was jealous of the fact that Duchamp could almost take a break and not say anything, you know, and still have the status that was equal to his own, you know. And I suppose the third godhead there, you know, I maybe there are probably others, but the three that stand out in my mind is Andy Warhol, Joseph Beuys, and Marcel Duchamp at that time. I know Duchamp is a little bit older, probably, but they're the three that stand out. And the encounter between Beuys and Warhol is kind of fascinating, because they met in the Guggenheim, and it was the first time and possibly the only time they met. And Warhol just went up to Beuys and like took his picture, you know, like he was another, I don't know, source of fascination, or like, you know, almost like a snapshot, you know, like let's get a snapshot of this guy, you know. So there was a kind of Beuys is always really so deep, and Warhol is so frivolous, you know. And you know, I don't know, maybe it was after that you know, Beuys decided to go in a new wave band or something. Maybe he was jealous of that too. I don't know, like, but you know, it's just so interesting that the people get locked into these personas.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a discussion recently with Sarah Long, and we were talking about biographies of artists. And it was interesting. I don't want to put words in her mouth, but she said like she always feels icky about artists having certain things in their biography that makes them either what you're speaking about here, enigmatic, or these kind of this certain phrasing in a biography that makes you feel a little bit icky. Is that true? Is it false? All this kind of stuff. And what you're talking about there, like this idea of the myth, it's what Andrea Fraser talks about, the myth of the artist. There's a kind of mythology behind the artist. And then you have the artwork. And the artist is always kind of weirdly in retreat, generally speaking, because the exhibition space becomes a place for the art, the dead art object after it has went through this lively process in the studio. And then the artist retreats away and you're left with this remnant of this, this thing, whether it's a painting, a sculpture, or whatever. And it's interesting in relation to Boyce in this image. He's at the background. He's standing behind. And I felt quite awkward watching it as well, which is kind of interesting. It felt kind of naff in a way, the way he was dancing and kind of...
Oh, it's totally naff.
Yeah, and the backing singers are kind of smiling. Well, he's quite serious. Like he's, as you say, didactic. Like he's like, oh yes, no more missiles. It's, as you say, it's at the time of the Cold War tensions, Reagan, all this kind of stuff is in the foremont in a sense that it's in behind him. And he's trying to be very sincere, And so this idea, like I'm trying to get, because you said so much really interesting things there about, the artist being an enigma and Boyce not really figuring it out because he's being pop, but also being really serious.
The only ambiguity in that song is in the title. Son, when you hear it, it's almost like a Derridian trick where Derrida would say something like différance, and the word différance with an E and the word différance with an A sound exactly the same, but when you see them written, they mean something different. So there's this paradox of same but different. And I think, sorry, that's a little bit of a pretentious sideline there, but like Boyce is playing on the word Reagan, and it's sun, not rain. But beyond that, if you read the lyrics, it's all about like, it's purely like straightforward criticism of the Cold War, So there's nothing, the fact that he's joining a new wave band doesn't really bring him down to earth. He doesn't quite make it, and it's all a bit like two halves. It's like the band and then there's him. And you're right, he's in the sort of background.
There's something interesting because every time I do these conversations, I screen print the image before I have the conversation. And it's a way of maybe just trying to manifest it away from the digital and get it more concrete in my head. And with yours, it's turned out the nicest, weirdly. And I don't know why that is. And when I was screen printing it, I decided I've done all the rest in black. And I wanted to do yours in blue because of the blue glare of the TV. It actually reminded me of, as a kid, when I was watching TV on really bad portable TVs. And I always had this blue glare, especially at nighttime. And so I screen printed it, but I used a different process this time. I used these dots because it felt poppy as well. It felt like Warhol or something like that. And it turned out beautiful. But it does feel transcendental because the facial, the eyes, the noses, even Boyce himself, they're kind of dissolving in these dots. And it has a kind of transcendental feeling to it. And I was thinking about, you talk about the silence of Marcel Duchamp, and it's actually good to hear that, the finishing of that, because I heard the silence of Marcel Duchamp before, but never is overrated. So there's like in that comment, there's a feeling that there's a jealousy in the remark.
Oh, and so much ego. So much ego.
Yeah. But like there was something about Deschamps, and it was something that I held on to, especially he did this lecture in the 60s, and it was called, I think it was called like, Where Do We Go From Here, or something like that. And it was all about this retreat, this kind of retreating underground. Like the artists, he had got sick of curators, critics, institutions. Now, I don't know, as you say, he's playing chess again, probably, but he was kind of, he had this ideology that the artist has to retreat underground now to become um, significant again. It's too mainstream.
You said underground.
Yeah, under.
I have this book right beside me, Notes from the Underground by Dostoevsky. That's good fun.
That's brilliant. But there's something about this, like that's why I brought up Kiefer earlier, because to get closer to Boyce or further away from Boyce, when you bring in Kiefer, who I was absorbed by, I loved Kiefer. I went to London when I was an art student to see one of his big retrospectives. I think it was in the Tate Modern. I think Boyce was a little bit part of it. And Boyce weirdly looks, the remnants of Boyce as an installation, not this new wave performance.
Sorry, did you say as an installation?
An installation, yeah. So like the lead, the felt, all this kind of
The
stuff.
fat. Don't forget the fat.
Yeah, yeah. And there was kind of something, it was very like Kiefer. It felt the same as Kiefer. And some people, separate Boyce away from Kiefer in that Kiefer is a real painter's painter in that he's solitary. He's all about this kind of mythology, this symbolic. There's something when I came across him of these cabins in the woods, and they had 1 point perspective, and I just loved him. I said, "Oh, you can paint this kind of stuff, and you can paint it this big," and it was like monumental, but kind of really mythological or fantastical or something. It really kind of got to me on a certain level. Whereas Boyce didn't, because I always felt he was out in the air. He was kind of participatory. He was going to schools. He was doing these blackboard lectures. But still, after when I saw his work in the flesh, I still got a sense of Kiefer from it.
There's definitely, though, a mythology of Boyce. Like, it's probably more profound than Kiefer. And I don't mean that there's substance. I mean that the mythology built up around Boyce. And like there's a lot of critics who I read throughout my, and I still read a bit about Boyce sometimes, but there's a guy called Donald Cuspet, I think. And like, he wrote about Boyce's shamanism as a PR stunt, that he kind of, I never felt quite comfortable with that analysis. I think, Boyce had this whole like backstory about how he was in the Luftwaffe, and I think he was in the Luftwaffe in the Second World War. And then I think, he had this idea that he crashed, and then these Tartar tribesmen like wrapped him in fat and felt and like dragged him across the desert like a scene out of Gladiator. And there's that scene where Maximus is being pulled on the back of some, like they probably lifted that from Boyce, and no, apparently none of this happened, but he did create a mythology, and he was really interested in mythology. And when he came to Ireland, and he did his whole like stint in Ireland, he did the blackboard lectures, but he also talked an awful lot about how Ireland was still holding the primordial mythological consciousness, whereas a lot of the other countries of the world, I think he made a map. I could be wrong now. I could be confusing this with a different map by the Surrealists, but I think he made countries in his map, depending on how mythologically grounded they were, he made them big or small. So Ireland was huge. Like Ireland was like Russia or something like that, because of the level of mythology, you know. So he was hugely into myth. He was into it. He kind of created his own myth, but he was also interested in anthroposophy. He was interested in Steiner. I think he learned from Steiner. I think he studied Steiner an awful lot. I think that was a massive influence on him. I'm not like, you know, and Steiner, I don't know about his self mythologizing, but he definitely encouraged, you know, kids to read myth, kids and adults, you know, to read myth as a sort of a, what would we call it, sort of a parallel to intellectual learning, that it was a sort of a powerful way to sort of educate the imagination rather than the intellect, you know. So yeah, so I think, you know, and obviously Boyce precedes Kiefer, so I think there's a massive mythologizing. Whether it comes from Boyce or whether it comes from other people is hard to determine. I mean, he did make up his backstory and he made up his self myth, but I think in the end, this is the depressing part, I think he sort of bought into his own myth and he began to believe the things that he was saying about himself. And, you know, the phrase I always use is he began to believe he was the magic man. And that's where he faltered, you know. It just became this like ego trip. And even though he seemed sort of modest and he had his like his braces and his hat and everything, I think he wasn't, you know, when he said, you know, the silence of Marcel Duchamp is overrated, that was a real sort of like flex. It was kind of like, you know, get off my patch kind of almost thing, you know, like it's real basic ego stuff, you know.
Yeah, it was interesting. Dominic Thorpe, who's a performance artist, who had a conversation with recently as well, and he spoke about Boyce and that work he did in New York, where he's dressed up. I think he's with a wolf or something.
It's a coyote.
Yes, a coyote. And I think Dominic had seen images of it. And this is interesting because it's something we were talking about before, which I'd love for you to elaborate on. So he saw the photograph of this, and he was really intrigued by it.
Caroline Tisdale took the photographs.
Okay, brilliant. But it seemed enigmatic. It seemed there was something really influential for Dominic as a performance artist to see this. But then he saw the recording of it, and it disappointed him. And I don't think he used the word disappointed, but it kind of, it took away something from the photograph. The photograph gave more in relation to what Dominic wanted from it, whereas the video piece, it kind of just, he said it was just kind of reductive. It didn't have the possibility that he imagined in the photograph. Yeah, and as coming from a performance artist is really interesting because there was so much he gained from the photograph, but not from the video, not from the thing. So you said something about that actually in our last discussion about being in art school again and talking about, you know, the difference between photographing performance. As this photograph is here that you've uploaded of Boyce in a performance, although a kind of odd one. And it's like, in a way, like, could you elaborate on that, the difference between the photograph of a performance, even though you don't do performance?
No, I don't.
Yeah, but it's kind of interesting your thoughts on that in relation to documentation and documenting performance.
Yeah. Well, I am a photographer, so I at least have that sort of angle on it. And I also, I suppose, I know quite a bit about Boyce. So I don't know if you know the ins and the outs of the piece. So do you want me to fill in a little bit of that? So the piece is done, I think it's around 75. And Joseph Boyce leaves Europe. he wraps himself. He gets on the plane, and as soon as he sets down in New York, he gets wrapped in felt. He gets put into the back of a New York ambulance, I think they were like sort of a public ambulance, whatever that means. I'm not sure what that means, but they weren't like, they were like around the streets the way cop cars. They'd be recognizable like cop cars. He's put into the back of it, wrapped in felt, and he's brought to the Rene Block Gallery, which I think was like in an apartment block or something like that. And they'd set up this chicken wire inside the gallery, and they had the coyote installed. And Boyce was brought right into the room before he was unwrapped. And then he spent 5 days, although you always get like different versions of this, where it's all Chinese whispers. Was it 5 days? Was it 7 days? And he lived inside this chicken wire coop with this coyote for 5 days. And he went through a series. So there were a lot of other things. There was a pile of newspapers. I think there were like turbines. There were some gloves. There was a walking cane. There was the piece of felt, and maybe some other. There was a triangle, a musical triangle, and all of these had kind of symbolic meaning for Boyce. And what he did was he went through a series of actions over the 5 days, and he always repeated the same cycle of actions. And what's really interesting is how the coyote reacted differently each time, and everything became laden with meaning because of the symbolism of the coyote is the scavenger and the native. It's kind of associated, I think, either in Boyce's understanding or in the understanding of the critics afterwards, but I'm not sure who put this meaning on it, but the understanding is that the coyote represents the Native American who has been sort of relegated to the status of a pest. And the idea is that Boyce, as European man, is coming back from Europe to sort of have some sort of I'm not getting the word in my head, but like a sort of to make up with the Native Americans, that's a terrible way of putting it, but like, that there's a reconciliation. There's a sort of an idea of reconciliation and meeting the spirit of coyote in the space and spending time there and going through rituals and seeing what comes of it. And then it was documented by this girl, Caroline Tisdale, and there's a famous book called Coyote, which is full of the photographs. I really understand what you said about the photographs, and I think you can invest a still image with so much meaning and imagination that when things are really explicit, like in a video, there's something about a video that doesn't leave much room for imagination to fill in the gaps. I'm reading at the moment a lot about street photography, and there's a theorist called Clive Scott who's written a book about street photography, and he talks about how imagination becomes the imaginary, and the imaginary is the idea that when the photograph is taken and time has passed, and this is really related to the Caroline Tisdale photographs because these are photographs relating to who were taken in history, years ago. But in street photography, because these are such ordinary situations, it actually after a while doesn't really matter what the date of the photograph is, because you're always going to come and invest your own meaning in it. And the further it is from when it was taken, Clive Scott makes out that there's actually more room to invest your imagination in the image. Yeah. Something else that I was reminded of was a performance that I did go to a lecture on when I was in art school by a guy called Stuart Brisley. Are you familiar with Stuart Brisley as a performance artist? I think his name is Stuart Brisley. He was like an early British performance artist, and I'm going to tell you about my experience of it. So I went to this lecture by my art history tutor, and it was just about the Stuart Brisley piece. And he did this thing where he like, as far as I remember, I could be, a little inaccurate in my memory on this, but he filled a bath full of offal and he climbed in. I think there was like offal and maybe some water in the bath, and he climbed into the offal and he submerged himself in the offal in this bathtub. And he went through this whole performance, but he he went through it a few times, and I I can't remember the details of it, but I said to my lecturer at the end of it, I went up to her and I was chatting to her afterwards, and I said, I actually think the photographs are more successful. They're stronger than the performance itself. And there was something about the performance. I think there was a video of the performance she showed in the lecture, and then there were photographs of just certain somebody had taken photographs from a certain angle of the bathtub with him submerged in the offal. And I don't think it was down to the eye of the photographer that these were more impressive. I think it was just something about this sort of reified image that there was a lot of action in the video, but when you had this, like, it was almost like, when we talk about the plastic arts, when we talk about painting or something, you move these substances, and then in one moment you say, right, that's it. And then you walk away and you let it dry and it solidifies. There's this feeling that I have about those photographs that, like, he was moving a lot, he was doing a lot of stuff, but this is a consolidation. This is a solidification of the action into a moment that it affected me way more. And I was just honest with my like art history tutor, and I said, I think these photographs are actually stronger than the performance. And she was like, oh no, oh no, no. But she always said that, like, that's not possible, It just isn't conceivable that, the photographs are more successful than the daring performance by this performance artist. And a couple of years, a year or two after I left art school, I went to this. I joined this multi discipline group. We were called DaySed in Dublin, and our whole idea was, like, we used to go out in the middle of Dublin at the quiet hour in the middle of the night once per month. And we used to do actions and perform. I actually did do a bit of performance, but it was more like exploration rather than actually performing. But we were invited to go to this. We sort of were around for a while, and then we were invited to go to this kind of seminar, for want of a better word, like where different artists got together and performed on the night, and then we all discussed it. Amanda Coogan was there, we were there, and there were other people there. Some quite well-known artists, but the title of the seminar was The Post-Performative. And I found that really fascinating because that reminded me of those photographs of the performance, that the performance was an entryway in, but if I had my way with Stuart Brisley's piece, the performance would have been the entryway in, and then the photograph would have been the product that hung in the gallery, So there's something, to go back to that idea that photographs allow you to fill in or invest with your imagination. Maybe that's the power of that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what it was. But all I knew was the photographs were way stronger than the performance, no matter what my art history teacher said.
It's like, yeah, no, there's just so much there. Like, there's two things I want to approach here, maybe. Like, this is very, in a way, kind of abstract. Like, two ways of approaching something very abstract and something very explicit, especially around boys, because remember you talk about the explicitness and the didactic nature of this performance.
Oh, just a voice. He's just
Yeah.
totally didactic.
It's very political. It's very on point. There's no abstraction, only the title. And there's something there between like mythology and politics, maybe that I'd only go into the kind of the criticism now, maybe of contemporary art that it's too aligned with political messaging at the moment. That like it's become less transcendental or less mythological, or it's become much more explicit in its aims and its messaging. And you get that very much in very big surveys or even in the Venice Biennale or something like that. It's very explicit.
I'm really interested here while you're talking in the fact that I could make gestures that are silent and it won't come out in the text, so nobody will know what my opinion about that is. So there's a space of interpretation that I can insert here into the text because I'm using my body.
But there's something about what we're talking about. Yeah, like I think back to Kiefer and Boyce and what I got from them as an artist and as a painter. It was very much about material. It was very much about something, I don't know, earthly, or I don't know, there was something substantial in it, maybe. Whereas politics never really, in the same way, caught my attention. I was always feeling that, when I heard Deschamps talking about underground or all these kind of things, I felt that, oh, that's something that, yeah, that sounds interesting. Whereas being out in the air with your voice, that's why I found it very awkward with Boyce standing on that stage looking at him. Whereas the image is much more interesting, as you're talking about there, about photography, the still image.
Can I just clarify something there? Because I didn't fully understand one thing. You were contrasting the idea of something, the underground, according to Duchamp. So artists need to go underground. And you contrasted that with being out in the air. So what do you mean by, what do you understand by those two things?
I think out in the air for me is, um, it's more like politics by definition is kind of a lie most of the time. Um, and the idea of, but it's always out in the air. It's like, I think you brought up there a few minutes ago, but he says something about the enemy is always it's a political stance, whereas the friend is something private. So um, there's something about being out in the air and being out in the open with your messaging and stuff like that is that's performative. Whereas when you retreat on the ground, like Deschamps or like Kiefer, where you're pulling away and you're kind of in a certain sense navel gazing, whether at your history or at your subjectivity, Um, there's something I'm trying to grasp it, and that's the difficulty in kind of articulating it. And it's only coming up now through having this conversation. But there's something about a myth, an enigma that is underground, that it's retreating all the time. It's private. Whereas there's something about the political that is much more performative. There's something. There's a lot of white lies in it. There's a lot of manipulation or strategizing in it.
But also maybe explicit.
Explicit. That's the main thing.
Yeah.
The difference between explicitness and implicitness, something inside. Um, I don't know where I'm going with that, but it's just like I'm trying to get closer to this idea of, I suppose, this Boyce image, which I've screen printed, that has this kind of intimacy, whereas the video document of that.
Did you watch the video itself, the music video?
Yeah. So it kind of, it took away from it. And then I brought it back. It's kind of this. This was the sequence of my experience of this. So I got that image, didn't know what it was, read the text, got a sense of it, went online, um, looked a little bit more, and then I watched the video. And then I was kind of going, oh, that's really
Nah.
awkward. And then I pulled it back. So I screen print.
Isn't that an interesting feeling,
Yeah.
though? I think that there's so much potential in that feeling. The feeling of awkwardness. Like, you're like, why does that feel awkward?
Yeah, and that's I suppose that's the thing with performance art as well. There is always a sense of awkwardness in it, especially when you're confronted with it, or the myth has been broken down a little bit. Yeah, so the myth. So the sequence was image, video, and then screen print, and the screen print brought it back to this sense of the aesthetic, to something more transcendental, something more mythological, something that had form that I could appreciate.
Like the photographs of
Like photographs.
Stuart Brisley or the boy's performance.
And I get what Dominic Thorpe was talking about, the photograph versus the document of that performance with the coyote, Boyce and the coyote, that he got so much more from the photograph as a performance artist than the document. And perhaps this is why a lot of performance artists use really beautiful, in some cases, stage photographs to document their work. That's the stuff that exists out there.
I didn't realize that. I didn't know that about performance artists.
Yeah. I suppose when I was in art school, there was a lot of argumentation around how do you document performance art. And there was a real issue there. But I never came across the moving. I suppose the moving image wasn't a thing back then. Now, today it is. Everything is being documented moving. Reels on Instagram, whatever it is, it's always moving. Whereas then the photograph was really important.
I just want to sorry. I just wanted to pick up a thread there. So I'm interested in what you said about Kiefer because I'm not as well read on Kiefer. I don't know as much about him, but I know a bit about him. And like what strikes me is like what I know about Kiefer is that he made an awful lot of art pieces after the war, which were sort of mocking. Or they were like, they weren't even just irony. They were sort of beyond irony. You know, these salutes that he did? After, obviously referring to the Nazis and the homeland and stuff like that, the idea of the homeland and all that. But like, okay, so he's sort of, let's say he's being ironic. I think he goes kind of beyond irony with those pieces, but let's say he's being ironic and he's mocking. But then he goes off and he creates a mythology himself. And I think one of the words that came to my mind when you were talking was the idea of mystique. I think sometimes artists cultivate a sense of mystique, and it has a kind of capital to it. So it's not that I'm like critical of Kiefer's myth making. I don't have any reason to criticize that, but I wonder how much when you see people myth making, whether mystique is a part of that, and whether that is kind of expedient, in some way when you're operating within the art world. No, that's all I wanted to say in reaction to what you were saying.
Yeah, like I think we're getting like, I suppose there's something about, like when I saw Kiefer first, I saw him in a book. I spoke to you about this before, actually, about, in some cases, I think I fell in love with photography over painting because I mistook a painting for a photograph or a photograph for a painting, I was kind of getting confused which one is which because I experienced painting first as photography, as a document of a painting, not the real thing.
Sorry, you experienced
A painting first as a photograph. So it was in an art book.
Oh, I see. So you're saying the documentation of the painting was the way you experienced the painting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So sometimes I feel maybe it's the photograph that's doing the thing. But with Kiefer, I knew straight away when I saw, like, because there were huge tomes of books for Kiefer, because he's such an established artist and name, that you got this really, in terms of scale, the size of these things. But then when I got to see his work in the flesh, it was even more than that. It was more substantial. And the myth, like this relationship between the artist's myth and the artwork that is manifested out of the artist, okay? That he became more mythological after experiencing the work. Like the work was so substantial and it's his scale. I think definitely scale lends to your awe of him, that he became even more substantial. Whereas Boyce, looking at this image, he kind of becomes less in the face of that documentation, that video documentation,
He becomes less monumental.
less monumental in a certain way.
And do you think him being in the background is part of that, or?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is. And I'm kind of wondering today if an artist, a performance artist, would do the same thing. Like, because in a way, today we're in an era that is very Boycean in the political messaging. It's kind of much more explicit, less abstracted, less transcendental, less individualistic, actually. It's more participatory and collaborative.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of ideology.
Lots of ideology. And it's very straight. It's very, I don't mean sexuality, but it's very straight in terms of its messaging. And I'm wondering, I suppose this is what I'm searching maybe through these conversations with artists, is that is there room for a more abstract? I know we're post avant-garde conceptualism and all that kind of stuff, but is there a space in which artists can, embrace more abstract ways of thinking? I suppose some of the stuff we're saying here, which is difficult to articulate, that's what, it's really difficult to articulate these things. But is there space, do you think? And as a painter, so I would love to touch upon your own feelings about your own work, but I'll give you this kind of premise in relation to painting. I was walking on this hike with my kids just the other week up the Cumshannon Mountains in Waterford. And we're going towards this waterfall. It's called Mahon Falls. And it's a long trek, but you see the waterfall in the distance. But it looks still. Okay, so it's a quite a big waterfall, and there's different outlets coming off the rocks. So it's going, but it looks really still. Actually, it looks like a kefir when I think about it, and it has that 1 point perspective. So you're looking directly at it through the mountains, and really still. And the kids said, "Oh, that looks like a painting because you can see the water is kind of frozen from a distance." But as you get closer, you actually see it moving, and then it becomes more and more, and then you hear the splashing, and then you hear people, and all of a sudden you're in it. But it's like the Boycean thing. He's dancing, and then the still image. They're very different things. And I was thinking about painting in relation to this as distance, like huge distances. When you experience a painting, that you're actually, even though you're up close to it, a painting, it could be very far away. Even though it looks flat, it could be just, you could be experiencing this thing in time and space that's really far away.
Do you mean in terms of perspective and things like that, or?
Yeah, like it's slow, the stillness. I suppose we're going back to this idea of stillness and abstraction rather than moving. That there's something about the stillness of painting and photography that gives us something not just to fill with our own fantasies and possibilities, but also if we want to, feeling all those other things that come with it. Um, so maybe in relation to painting, because you're a painter and I see paintings in the background in your studio, maybe discuss a little bit about that or this idea of painting as reframing the
Well,
world.
before I transition into painting, I just want to say one thing about photography because I am very interested in photography and I do take a lot of photographs. So I remember maybe it's about 3 years ago I opened a book, and it's a book called, it's like one of these sort of readers on photography, like it's called something like why it does not have to be in focus, or why, or how to take better photographs, or something. It's probably not that like basic, but anyway, there was an image by a famous photographer in it of a small girl, and she was in a duffel coat, and she was just turning on a footpath, and she was completely sharp, completely in focus, but she was in the middle of a fast action, like the action of turning around very quickly. But she was completely still, completely focused, completely sharp, right? And there was commentary on it under the photograph, and it said, street photographers often use high shutter speeds in order to um, uh, abstract motion from the sort of ebb and flow of daily life. Let's put it like that, right? And at the moment, I'm putting together a PhD proposal about street photography. I'm very interested in street photography as both as a historical thing and as an art form itself, as a genre of photography. And what was I going to say about that? Sorry. Um, there's I'll come back to that. That's just slipped out of my head. But there's something about street photography, and there's an idea that I've come across in my reading about how art can, because we live in a time when so many things are trying to call for our attention, in terms of social media, online stuff like that, that and also that there's a lot of calculation. That's the word. Calculation about what will appeal to people's attention, how to get things to people's eyes, and even in stuff like algorithmic warfare and stuff like that. It's all these calculations, but there's a certain blindness to that. It's what Bernard Stiegler calls artificial stupidity, as opposed to artificial intelligence. There's a certain but if we just stay in the visual channel for the moment, there's a certain blindness to these calculated visuals that we live with. And this one theorist was talking about how art could actually intervene in in that in that milieu in order to highlight parts of vision that we don't encounter on a daily basis, and actually parts of vision that actually maybe the human eye is not conscious of or can't even perceive. And I actually believe that street photography kind of does that. Like street photography freezes a person in place who's turning very, very quickly and makes an incredible image. And a slightly, there's an abstraction to that which actually creates the aesthetic. There's something about the distance you're talking about, or the abstraction, that creates the aesthetic. You will never see that girl frozen like that with your eyes. It takes a camera to do that. And that creates the sense of, there's two pieces of abstraction in that photograph. The first is that it's black and white. So you're automatically getting a certain abstraction with black and white. And the second is that the motion is frozen, where you would never see that in real life with your eyes. But yet you're looking at something you recognize, and you see a milieu around that thing that you recognize. So there's a certain, the word that Aristotle used was pathos. There's a certain pathos along with the abstraction. And I think both are needed, not just the distance, right? We talked before about how using pop culture in art adds a sense of affect, like adds a sense of emotional connection. And, there's a lot of art, or rather, there isn't a lot of art, I would say, that doesn't have that quality and doesn't appeal on that level in the contemporary. And maybe the whole like political stroke ideological streak that you see going through a lot of contemporary art is quite the opposite. Maybe it's just too it's too it's almost obscene. And I mean that in the technical sense of the word. And the word obscene means like turning towards the scene directly. Like it's too explicit. It's too direct. There's not enough room for investing with your imagination. There's not enough room for interpreting, having space to interpret, for investing your own life in what you're looking at. So I think distance has always been a part of the philosophy of art. In other words, aesthetics. When you look at the idea of the beautiful and the sublime as part of the picturesque, there's a distancing thing there. But there's also a sort of, the sublime is that other force, that empathy, that it's not quite an empathy though, it's more of a shock. It's another emotional quality, But like you look back at Nietzsche and the way he writes about the tragedy, that's there's a distance and there's a connection in that.
Yeah, like just to follow on what you're talking about distance there, once again, Sarah Long was talking about how she paints up close to her paintings. That sometimes she lies prostrate on them and tries to paint them close. Um, and I thought that was fascinating. I remember seeing also Basquiat going back to kind of Warhol and poppy kind of stuff. Like I see documentation of him, moving documentation of him up close, like with a pen, like trying to draw like that right in front of the canvas, like really close. There's no distance and stuff like that.
When you're talking about Sarah Long, how close does she lie like sort of along the ground in front of the painting, or?
Yeah, like in her book W, she talks about this. I think she uses the word prostrate. So lying maybe on top or close. And then her work is very much not about embodiment or a body in the landscape, but the landscape itself, like that. She's all about this idea of the viewer entering the landscape, and there's no obstacle of a person or personages within the landscape. That there's something open.
Because when I think of somebody lying prostrate, I almost think of them, their body as a landscape, like a.
Yeah.
So you've seen photographs, like surrealist photographs like that, with like a woman's body becoming like the hills of a landscape or something like that. That's really fascinating.
So I suppose, like, I really want to touch upon painting, and just your own work, because, like, I find it fascinating to listen to you conceptually, how you speak about art. You read art. You read different ways of thinking about art, photography, painting, whatever, performance. You do the same thing as me, actually, because I did the same thing. I wrote an essay about Picasso when I went to Dún Laoghaire.
All right. So you were in Dún Laoghaire.
Yeah, first, yeah.
How long were you in Dún Laoghaire?
4 years.
Oh, you did your degree in Dunleary.
Yeah,
I didn't realize that. So did you have Tom, Dr. Tom?
I did.
Yeah, and he always gives that essay, that how innovative was Picasso. You wanted to know more about my painting. Not well, it has voice, but not explicitly. It's okay. So I'll tell you about an experience I had in my development. So I went to the NCAD graduate show in about 95. I think it was summer of 95. And as usual, I don't know if this is your experience of going around, I'll say exhibitions in general, not just graduate shows. But these days, because, you've gone to so many exhibitions, I've gone to so many exhibitions that when I walk around now, I have a kind of a radar. And I cannot spend my energy looking at every single piece of art. So I sort of scan, and then I sort of, and I know there's people who read or listen to this and will go, oh, you should give everybody your time. But like, I don't have that much energy. And you do develop a radar for there's something, and especially if you're an intuitive person, like I have a kind of my Myers-Briggs profile is that I'm a thinking intuitive. So I really trust when my radar sort of, I have no idea why, but I need to look at this. There's something interesting here, and I go towards it, and that tends to work, I think. I'll never really know because I don't look at the other things, so who knows. But I did my thing and I went to this exhibition. At this time, I was seasoned enough that I wasn't looking at everything, but I was like going around and, when you go to graduate exhibitions, you'll see like about 10%. I'd see about 10% of stuff that I think is really, you know, really needs to be looked at. Like I look at more than that, but 10% of it really needs to be looked at. Like it's really interesting and there's something to be gleaned from it or learned or just, even on just an aesthetic experience, you need to stand in front of this and connect to it. But I walked into this one space and this guy, and just to, just as a back note on this, if that's a word, I had been sort of looking for who I would like to emulate as a painter. I had this thing where I started painting in second year and I was now at the end of my third year. So I'd been painting for 2 years, but I really didn't know who I wanted to emulate. None of the painters that I saw in my art history lectures and my cultural studies lectures really jumped out and said, you need to paint like this, like this is somebody you need to emulate. And I was like, there were people who appealed. Like I kind of liked, Peter Doig, and I liked Francis Bacon, but I didn't want to be as dark as Francis Bacon. I mean, if it came out as dark as that, I'd just let it be. But like, I didn't think that, that was my exact subject matter. I wasn't going to be like, taking photographs of animals with their mouths open and stuff and, trying to paint their teeth or something. So, like, I was on this journey where I was looking for somebody who just would inspire me so much that I would want to emulate. Because I think when you're learning to paint, you need to have role models. You need somebody to emulate so that not only are you understanding what your style is, but you're motivated to paint and learn skills so that you can emulate, so it's a real motor for like learning how to paint. Um, so, and as I said to a friend of mine yesterday, I think when you ask a genuine question, the answer is on the way. You just have to kind of sit and wait in a way for the answer to arrive, So I walk into this space in the graduate exhibition, not even thinking about like, oh, this is, where I'll find my answer. But this guy had done these very beautifully expressive paintings of figures, like nudes, but in spaces. So there was a real compositional element. There was something about the way the composition of the space around the nude was done. And they weren't all nudes either. They were like, clothed figures, whatever. But there was a sense of abstraction to them, but there was also a sense of gesture and mark making that was reminiscent to me of like abstract expressionism. So it was kind of like it kind of felt like abstract expressionism in the application of the paint, but these were discernible figures sitting in discernible spaces with geometry. So I went over to the guy and I was like, wow, I really love what you're doing here. I was blown away. Like, and this wasn't even intellectualized. I had no idea what I was looking at. And it doesn't sound that radical. Like, but I went over to her and I was like, I really love what you're doing here. Like, who are your influences? Like, what painters are you looking at? And he said immediately, I'm interested in the Bay Area figurative painters in the 50s in San Francisco. And I was like, interesting, never heard of them. Going to write that down. And I went off and I did my research. And the first catalog that I bought was, I'll show you the catalog. It's beautiful. So I bought this catalog, which is Bay Area figurative painting. Yeah, you can see the title there anyway. So I absolutely fell in love with this movement. It wasn't just like one painter. There were at least 4 or 5 painters here that were just doing something that I loved. And I think what it was, if as you asked me to sort of, cognitively kind of analyze this, there's a thing of the tension between the geometry and the gesture or the movement of the paint in these artworks. But it isn't just that. There's a sort of an abstraction versus a figuration. I mean, I know a lot of painters are interested in this, where there's a sort of there's an abstract level to the painting, but paradoxically it's also figurative, and there's a kind of a tension between those two things. I mean, that's appealing for a reason. There's something in that. It's almost like when I talked about the photograph of the girl turning and being frozen. There's a level of empathy. There's a level of knowing what this is, but it sort of makes you take a second look, because you're like, I've never seen anything like that. Like, there's something kind of, it's not even shock, but it's just visual interest, because you're like, wow, like there's something about her pose in that photograph that's like monumental. It's iconic or something. It's just the gesture of the body. And it's the same in the paintings. There's this sort of, there's not only the sort of very gestural brushstroke contained in some way within the geometry, but there's also sort of the abstract intention with the figurative in a very mutually beneficial way. And I do think, like, whenever we talk about, and this is getting back to Derrida, whenever we talk about paradoxes, paradox itself is impossible. Like, we can almost get there, but it has to fall on one side of the line or the other. And I think the Bay Area figurative painters are actually, they're figurative painters. They're not abstract painters, but they're so familiar with abstract expressionism. They all started as abstract expressionists, almost to an individual, But then they turned around in the midst, and that's a whole other history that's so fascinating. They turned around right in the middle of abstract expressionism and started painting the figure again. And then they were all on the West Coast and East Coast artists. So you've probably heard of Diebenkorn, right? So Diebenkorn, of course you have. Diebenkorn is like painting in his studio on the West Coast in California. And he turns around and he starts painting the figure. And I think it was, I'm not sure, one of those abstract. So he was famous in New York already for his abstract expressionism. He was up and coming abstract expressionist artist in New York. And one of the New York painters came across the country to visit him. And he came into his studio and he saw him like painting these figurative paintings. And he like literally said to him, like, have you lost your mind? Like, what are you doing? Like, this is madness. You know, and Diebenkorn was like, no. Abstract expressionism is a very limited cul-de-sac. And I want out. And he was like, we're gonna do our thing and we're gonna go our way, you know. And there were other artists who, you know, there's a guy called David Park who influenced Diebenkorn. Park was the first one to sort of do the figurative thing with the abstract expressionist gesture. He wasn't, in my opinion, not the greatest of those painters, but he had a great influence on Diebenkorn and all these other painters. And they had all come back from the Second World War. A lot of them were in the military. I think they were drafted. So there was a thing called the GI Bill where they got like they got money to go back to university and get educated. And a lot of these guys went to art school. So they were both teaching and learning in art school. So Diebenkorn taught a lot of the guys who followed him. So it was like Park, Diebenkorn, and another guy called Bischoff. And then they all sort of, there was like first generation, second generation, third generation. And there's still a stream of like Bay Area figurative painting. But I think, you know, to come back to why does this really appeal? First thing I like is there's barely any surrealism. The whole subject of surreal, the whole thing of surreal subject matter doesn't work with this for some reason, in my opinion. So there's one guy called, I think his name is Theophilus Brown, and he did a kind of a weird mystical turn on this. You know, there's like paintings with like two moons in the sky, or like some strange sort of mystical kind of configuration to the painting. But most of them are painting people sitting drinking coffee, or a jazz band, or people playing American football, or, you know, really everyday stuff. But the way they paint them is just, it's more about I kind of would liken it to impressionism or street photography. You're painting the everyday, but you're doing it in a way that is really interesting. So it's not, you know, and I find this really interesting actually in respect to what we've been talking about, you know, about these, you know, these transcendental figures or whatever, and this kind of mystical stuff and this like metaphysical stuff. Sorry, not metaphysical. We didn't use the word metaphysical, I don't think. But, you know, coming back to boys, coming back to myth making, all this kind of stuff, you know. I like the fact that these guys paint the everyday, and they do it and girls. Actually, there's a couple of women involved in the movement as well, you know, particularly one. There's an emotionality to the work, but not overly emotional. The sort of the formality, the sort of geometric formalism of it, not formality, but formalism, sort of holds it in check through kind of an abstract level of the painting. So there's this, again, it's that perfect tension. They're my biggest influence, I would say, in what I do. So I'm always thinking about the relationship of foreground to background, geometry to gesture. Composition is huge, and I think that feeds back into my interest in photography as well. I think I was a photographer before I was a painter. But I've learned so much from painting since I took up painting that feeds back into my photography. And I've even literally taken photographs and gone, oh my God, this is so like a Diebenkorn, or it's so like a one of the paintings that I would do, you know, like you weirdly begin to look at reality and find textures and stuff that actually are like the photographic version of the painting that you're doing, you know. So um yeah. So that's a major influence. And I have a love though for traditional gods of painting. I love Sargent. I think Sargent is such an incredible draftsman, and that's always been a big thing in my practice is draftsmanship. Um, like I've always been good at drawing. I don't mind saying that. I don't, you know, there's no false modesty. Like I'm good at drawing, and I have always enjoyed drawing, and I did it way before I painted. Um, I think Sargent is awesome. You know, his society portraits, no matter what you think of them, they're obviously the sort of like People magazine or whatever of the day. But like, you do that, try and do that, like, you know. And then when he loosens up and he becomes older and he's like, no, screw this, I want to do what I want to do. That's when he really catches fire. Like, he's incredible. There's another guy in Madrid called Sorolla, who's kind of he's like the Spanish Sargent. He's amazing, an amazing painter. I love Whistler. I love Whistler for his soup, what he calls his soup, which is his kind of the way that he mixes his paint and he applies his paint. And he has a level of abstraction in his work. There's definitely a musical, compositional level to his work that's absolutely exquisite. I've always had a love for Monet. I think Monet is Impressionism. I don't care what other people say, but like, obviously that's way too reductive. But you know, but without Monet, like Monet is, you know, and I know like people be like, yeah, Monet, God, like, you know, that's the ultimate chocolate box Impressionism. But like, again, you do that, you know, like that is, he's amazing. Like, that's an amazing, like but then again, like I knew I loved Monet before I went to art school. I would never have tried to emulate Monet in my own practice. That's just obviously just, you can love that stuff without, you know, without wanting to go there now. Like, you know, you know, you can see the incredibleness of it. Um, Whereas the Bay Area figurative painters, obviously, that's kind of a 1950s movement. So obviously, I don't even want to go there anymore. But everything that I've learned from that, the trick is, how do you innovate, for want of a better word? How do you move beyond it without sacrificing everything that you've learned? You know, and that's the trick. Yeah, and I'm still. I mean, that's our practice. That's what you're trying to do. You know, hopefully, anyway, that's hopefully what people are trying to do. I don't know. Did you know the Bay Area figurative painters before?
No, not at all. Like, how do you say it's spelled? Diebenkorn or yeah, so when I saw your work, I really saw his work in it because I was looking at his work as well, and that whole era following on from Expressionism. Um, I found it fascinating. Like, and you can see some artists even out today that are, you know, someone like Mairead Haka.
Oh, I love her painting.
Hers are very geometrical but organic, and you know, there's all this. Yeah. So is that out there, and I can see the value in it. I have to go in a minute because but it's actually like you tied it up lovely there actually at the end because I was going to jump in at the end when you were talking about transcendentalism, what we've been talking about. And when you were talking about the groundedness of the Bay Area, like the everyday, and especially in terms of surrealism, and that all, then you went back to Boyce, and you went, well, that's what we've been talking about actually all along. That was gorgeous. Yeah, loads to talk about, Andrew. Think about, Andrew. Like Jesus, we could do this again sometime. It's like. But listen, for now, I want you to think about. I'm going to send you one of these screen prints because I think they're lovely. And because I did an ultramarine, it's kind of beautiful thing, but I'll send it to you. And I want to do this zine. I'm doing these zines with everyone I'm doing these with. So this 16-page thing, object.
That's great.
So have a think about it, especially in relation to what we talked about, because I broached things that I haven't even thought about before here today. That's why I'm doing this thing, actually, because you're kind of freewheeling. You're kind of going, oh, what the hell am I thinking about here? And that's the good thing about it. So, yeah, just have a think about, all those things we're talking about. The everyday, your own interests in painting, your own influences, the transcendental, mythology.
I'll give you 2 tidbits as departing shots. We started talking about Jeremy Deller before. He's a very interesting artist with regards pop culture, but also, there are serious messages in the work as well. I find him really fascinating. He's not an artist who does anything like I do. I'll never work in the way that Jeremy Deller works. I've done installations, but he was somebody I kind of had an affair with, and then I sort of fell out of that affair again, but again, I learned a lot from. And the other one is Ghostbusters. Ghostbusters, if you notice, the car that they drive around in is actually the ambulance, the New York ambulance. And I have a feeling that whoever wrote it had some memory of Boyce doing that performance in New York. And, we're talking about the sort of the metaphysical. We're talking about, Boyce is addressing spirits. He's addressing the spirit of Coyote, blah, blah, blah. And then these guys just make it into a comedy about the occult. And, and they really ground it. It's super grounded. It's a classic 80s movie. I love it. It's just incredible. It's an incredible comedy. And even the word Ghostbusters to me sounds like Dustbusters. Those machines, but I just feel like, I love that. Like, you're taking something, if it's true that there's some weird connection between Ghostbusters and I Like America and America Likes Me, they've taken it and they've transmuted it into something of total joy.